Before forests, before dinosaurs, before humans, life belonged to the ocean. For millions of years, these shallow seas were crowded with small, armored lives. Above them moved straight-shelled hunters, silent shapes from a world almost impossible to recognize. The seafloor was not empty. It was a living city built from shells, stalks, and slow movement. Danger already existed here. But it was not the predator that would destroy this world. Then, almost invisibly at first, the ancient world began to cool. For animals fixed to the seabed, even a small change could become a sentence. The sea did not burn. It withdrew. On land, there were no forests, no herds, no footsteps. The story of life was still written beneath the waves. Every layer of the water held a different way to survive. Even the smallest drifting lives were part of the ocean's fragile machinery. Here, hard skeletons built shelter for countless smaller lives. Predators passed like shadows, but the real danger was still far beyond their senses. This was not an empty prehistoric ocean. It was a world. The ocean seemed endless, but its edges were controlled by climate. As ice expanded, water was pulled out of the seas and locked away on land. The richest habitats were also the most vulnerable, the shallow shelves. Armor could protect them from predators. It could not protect them from a disappearing sea. Some could move away, but escape only led into colder, darker water. This was only the beginning. As the seas withdrew, the first great extinction tightened its grip. To understand the disaster, we must first see the world it erased. Across the seabed, trilobites moved like armored shadows. Many could not flee at all. Their survival depended on the water staying stable. These were animals, not plants, living towers feeding from the current. Long before sharks, straight-shelled cephalopods moved through these waters. Hard skeletons built shelter, and shelter allowed diversity to grow. This ocean already had hunters and hunted, but extinction would come from the world itself. Every creature here was linked by the same water, the same currents, and the same fragile balance. At first, the change may have been subtle, a current, a temperature, a season that no longer behaved the same. For the animals that could not move, the water itself had become their only warning. The first great extinction did not begin with fire. It began with cold. As ice grew across the land, the oceans began to lose their shallow edges. The places with the most life were the first places to vanish. A body built for the seabed had nowhere to go when the seabed became land.
The living forest of the seafloor could not walk away.
Those that could move fled the shallows, but the deeper water offered no promise. Even the drifting life of the open water was caught in the change. The ocean was still there, but it was no longer the same ocean. The first sign of collapse was not always chaos. Sometimes it was space where life used to be. As the water fell away, the ancient ocean became a maze of stranded pools and empty stone. The sea did not vanish all at once. It broke apart. For small animals on the seabed, the world had become a prison of shallow water. The animals fixed to the bottom could not follow the retreating sea.
The living forest of the seafloor began to fall silent.
Even hunters were trapped inside a world that was shrinking beneath them. The larger swimmers followed the last corridors of water into the dark. Communities that had once been connected became islands of water in a spreading desert of shells. Some moved with the water, but the paths were narrowing. The seafloor had become a shoreline of remains. Even away from the shore, the water itself was changing. A pool could look like a refuge, but without circulation, it became a trap. The shrinking sea pushed animals together that would once have kept their distance. Escape into deeper water meant entering a colder world with less to feed on. The structures that once gave shelter became stranded stone. Across ancient coastlines, entire worlds of shallow water were being erased. When the channels closed, each pool became its own failing world. Inside the cutoff pools, movement slowed. Without moving, water, food, and oxygen no longer arrived the way they once had. The crowded bottom became patchy, then sparse, then almost silent. The first great extinction was no longer a warning. It had become the new shape of the world. The ocean had not vanished completely, but the world beneath it was failing. The survivors moved through a world that no longer fed them the same way. For the animals fixed in place, stillness became dangerous.
The living towers that once fed from the current began to break and vanish.
Water remained, but it was no longer the open sea. The survivors were not choosing this place. The falling sea had left them here. Even the hunters lost their advantage when the water itself turned against them. The retreat continued, pulling the center of life farther and farther away. The survivors gathered in the remaining water, but the ocean they knew was gone. The extinction can be seen not in screams, but in silence. The seafloor forest fell, and the water above it opened into emptiness. Life had not ended, but it had been pushed into fragments. For marine life, the moving shoreline was a line between survival and extinction. The thinning reached upward, into the drifting life of the water itself. A hunter in an empty ocean is also a victim of collapse. Each pool became a separate gamble, and most were losing. There was no single moment of death, only a narrowing of possibilities. A place once crowded with seafloor life now held only the shapes it left behind. The first great extinction had turned the ocean from a cradle of life into a test few could survive. By now, the collapse was no longer local. The silence was spreading across the seafloor.
For countless shell-building animals, the end came as stillness.
Mass extinction does not erase every life at once. It narrows the world until only fragments remain.
When the living forest fell, the seafloor lost height, shelter, and motion.
When the bottom communities failed, the animals above them lost the foundation of their world.
Even the drifting life of the open water became sparse. A refuge could last for a day, a season, or not long enough. For an ocean animal, a few centimeters of dry shell could become a wall. What had been habitat became a plain of shells. There was still water. But water alone was not enough to rebuild a world. In one patch after another, communities faded into fragments. Survival belonged to the few that remained connected to water that still worked. A refuge was not a paradise. It was simply a place that had not failed yet. The food web did not snap in one place. It thinned at every level. The shallow sea had been the center of life. Now it was a cold plain of shells. The future belonged not to the strongest, but to those that found the last stable water. Not every place failed. In deeper pockets, life held on. Where the current still moved, the smallest pieces of the old world continued. Above them, a few larger forms still moved through the weakened sea.
The ancient oceans had died across vast places, but in the fragments, life still held a narrow door open.
After the collapse, the ocean did not return to what it had been. Some trilobites survived, but they moved through a world that had been stripped down. Survival did not mean abundance. It meant a few shells still opening in the current.
Even in the water column, survival was thin and scattered.
Larger survivors moved through the ruins of a food web that had once been vast.
The aftermath was not a fresh beginning. It was a simpler, poorer sea.
Survival happened in small numbers, in small places. The world did not warm simply because the worst had passed. Where the ocean had been richest, cold air now moved across shell and stone.
The future of the ocean survived in places like this, reduced, hidden, and fragile. Hard shells and armored bodies would leave traces long after the living world changed.
The disaster would become a pattern in stone, doomsday, abundance, loss, and silence. In time, the living crisis became a record written in layers. After the extinction, the ocean continued, but it was not the same ocean.
Recovery did not begin as a triumph. It began as a few small lives continuing.
The ocean was wounded, but motion had not disappeared.
Extinction creates emptiness, and emptiness can become opportunity.
The recovery would not be fast, but time still belonged to life.
What disappeared from the water remained in stone. The first great extinction changed the planet, but it did not end the story of life.
The ocean that vanished did not disappear completely. It left its memory in stone.
In some layers, shells crowd together, a record of seas once full of life. The Trilobites' armor became a signature, still readable hundreds of millions of years later.
In the rocks, the story becomes a pattern: richness, disruption, and loss. From these traces, we can rebuild a world tunkrund, carefully, piece by piece. Recovery began quietly, in small patches that barely resembled the world before. The survivors were not heroic giants. They were small, persistent, and lucky.
Where currents returned, feeding could begin again.
But recovery was not a sudden bloom. The sea was still thin. The ocean still held movement, but the scale of life had changed.
Life returned as patches, not as a kingdom.
The living scenes are gone, but their shapes remain pressed into the earth.
Above the waves, the land remained almost empty. The recovery still belonged to the sea.
Beneath the surface, the survivors continued the work of existence.
In the end, survival was carried by small bodies moving through a changed sea.
From fragments like this, the next ocean would eventually grow. In human time, recovery would seem impossible. In Earth time, it had already begun.
A fossil is not only a remnant, it is a doorway back to a living world.
The planet was quieter now, but silence was not the same as death. From these fragile remnants, the next chapter of ocean life would begin. After the first great extinction, life was smaller, quieter, and scattered.
One small body moving forward was enough to keep the story alive.
Recovery was not loud. It was a shell opening in moving water.
Above the survivors, the water still carried ancient shapes through the dark. Hundreds of millions of years later, the silence would still be readable.
Earth had suffered its first great biological catastrophe, but beneath the cold sea, life still held on. The future was not on the empty land. It was here, hidden in the remaining sea.
From almost nothing, the ocean began the slow work of becoming alive again.
The first great extinction proved that life could be broken and still continue. But this would not be the last time the oceans fell silent. Next, the coral kingdoms would begin to die.